In the summer of 1945, on an island in Narragansett Bay, the United States Army was running a classroom. There is a photograph of one of those classrooms, a blackboard with English words chalked up on it, "thing" and "think" among them. An American sergeant in front of the board, pointing, and in front of him, German prisoners of war, taken out of the fighting by the same army that was now teaching them the difference between those two words. The course of study had a name. The name of the course was Democracy. One of the instructors in that school was a captain named William Moulton. Before the war, he was a linguist. He taught German at Yale. Now he was one of 30 or 40 instructors in the language department of the strangest school the United States Army has ever run, and his students were the enemy. 2 years later, the Army sent that same man back to Germany to find out whether any of it had been worth doing. The school is not the remarkable part. The audit is. Stay in that room with me, because everything else runs out of it. The island is Conanicut Island, in Rhode Island, and the post is called Fort Getty. It is an old coastal defense fort, which means it is quiet and out of the way and easy to keep an eye on. In the summer of 1945, it is holding a few hundred German prisoners at a time in 60-day cycles, and the men in this camp go to class. Who are they? Not the men you would expect. To fill these schools, the Special Projects Division went through 17,883 prisoners. Out of all of them, 816 were picked out as candidates for Fort Getty. 43% of the men picked held university degrees. A quarter had been businessmen or white-collar professionals. About 1 in 10 had worked in German government administration before the war. So this is not a camp full of soldiers. It is a camp full of lawyers and teachers and civil servants and newspapermen who happen to be wearing the uniform of a country that is about to stop existing. And that tells you what the school was for before anybody says a word about ideals. Germany was going to have to be run by somebody. In the summer of 1945, that country had no government, no police anyone could trust, no courts, no working press. The United States Army was about to be handed a zone of occupation the size of a small nation, and almost nobody to staff it with. So it went looking in the one place where it already had several 100,000 Germans sitting in rows, already fed, already counted, already under American control. The men in that classroom were not being rescued. They were being interviewed. One of them, at his graduation, said this out loud. What sincere and deep faith in man must live in a people who conceived a school like this and made it a reality? He meant it. And the country he was praising had built the thing without telling anybody it existed. The idea had been turned down once already. In June of 1943, a plan to re-educate German prisoners reached the desk of the Provost Marshal General, the officer responsible for every prisoner of war in American hands. He shelved it. He shelved it because he thought Germany would take it out on American prisoners if it found out, and because he did not think it was worth the effort. It sat there for more than a year. Then, in the autumn of 1944, the office of the Provost Marshal General created something called the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division. In official correspondence, it was almost never spelled out. It appears as 6 letters, POW, SPD. The man handed the division to run was a lieutenant colonel named Edward Davison. He was a poet. Born in Scotland, published books of verse, taught at American universities, and in September of 1944, the United States Army put him in charge of changing the minds of several 100,000 enemy soldiers. Here is the first thing that tells you what kind of operation this was. Davison did not set up in Washington. He set up shop on Broadway in Lower Manhattan, and he did it on purpose. He wanted to be away from the War Department and close to the media people in New York. The Army put a tight veil of secrecy over the whole thing. Two of the officers involved argued that there should be no publicity whatsoever, that it should be top secret, at least until the war in Europe was finished. And it held. This program ran for months inside a camp system that outsiders walked through, and the War Department did not reveal that it existed until within weeks of the German surrender. And there was an obstacle sitting in front of this whole idea, which is that, at the time, the Geneva Convention was read as ruling out the indoctrination of prisoners of war. Then somebody went back to the treaty and noticed the article numbered 17. The Army quoted that article in its own official history, and here is the part that matters. So far as possible, belligerents shall encourage intellectual diversions and sports organized by prisoners of war. Intellectual diversions. That clause is there to protect prisoners from boredom. It tells a captor to let men put together a chess club, a choir, a lecture of their own. It says nothing about a curriculum written in New York. Two different accounts of this program describe what happened next, in two different ways, and I think the pair of them together is the most honest version available. One says somebody noticed a loophole. The other says the Special Projects Division took a liberal interpretation of the clause. Either way, the official, deliberately boring cover name the Army chose for the largest re-education campaign it had ever attempted on prisoners was the Intellectual Diversion Program. They took the name straight out of the article they were leaning on. I want to stop the story here and show you something I took out of this video. When I started, I had a number, a very clean number. Somebody had gone back to Germany with a fixed list of names, had found a precise number of those men, and had done it in a precise number of days. 3 figures, tidy enough to put in the title. I could not source any of it. Not in the Army's own history, not in either of the 2 books this story actually lives in. The report those numbers supposedly come from sits in a German federal archive and in one dead man's private papers, and I could not put my hands on either. So the tidy version is gone, and what you are going to get instead, later on, is the number I could stand behind. It is messier, it is less satisfying, and it is true. I am telling you that because this whole video is about an institution that went back and checked its own work. And it would be a strange thing to make that video without doing the same. If you want more history where the number that did not survive the check gets said out loud instead of quietly dropped, subscribe. Every man named in this video was a real man. No composite characters. The records are in the description. And if you catch me in something, put it in the comments, and I will pin it. So who paid for all this? This is the part I did not expect, and it is the part that stayed with me. Because a school is not an idea. A school is a building with heat in it, desks, books, blackboards, film projectors, salaries. Somebody has to write the checks. Start with a fact about camp life that sounds like nothing. The camps had canteens, a store. A prisoner could buy cigarettes there and soap and small things using coupons he earned working. Only good inside the wire. Now, the Army's own history of the prisoner of war program is a public document. Department of the Army Pamphlet 20-213, published in 1955. Anyone can read it. On page 160, it explains what happened to the money those camp stores made. Although the canteen was a government agency, it was not operated entirely with appropriated funds, and the profits did not accrue to the Treasury. Instead, and in accordance with Article 12 of the Geneva Convention, they accrued for the benefit of the prisoners of war. The profit from the camp store did not go back to the United States government. It went into a fund that legally belonged to the prisoners. And then, on that same page, the Army says what the fund was spent on. The expenses of the educational program, including the pay of the director and teachers, came from the prisoner of war fund of the camp served. Now, I have to be careful here because this is the sentence I nearly got wrong. And getting it wrong would have been the worst error in this video. Read the lines above it and you find out which school it is talking about. The War Department encouraged the prisoners to organize study courses of their own. It let them pick a director of studies out of their own group. It let them select their own teachers and instructors out of their own ranks, and gave those men free time to do it. Those are the teachers being paid. The classroom being funded there is the one the prisoners built themselves. And that is still a remarkable thing. The ordinary education inside an American prisoner of war camp was paid for by the prisoners, out of the profit on their own cigarettes. It runs all through the record. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, a music dealer supplied the instruments the camp wanted, and he was paid out of canteen funds. The camps were sent films for morale and reorientation, and the prisoners who ran the projectors were paid out of the admission receipts of the prisoners watching. In the Army's own words, the prisoners directly paid the operators for their services. Even the newspaper worked this way. The division printed a German-language paper for the camps, and it did not hand it out. It sold it, 5 cents a copy, in 134 camp canteens. There was a reason for the price, and the reason was not revenue. The men running the program understood that a newspaper given away free reads as propaganda, and a newspaper you have to pay for reads as a newspaper. So they charged for it. The print run climbed from 11,000 copies to 75,000, and more than 73,000 of those sold. It paid for itself. It turned a small profit. The American taxpayer was not charged for it. Now go looking for the other school, the one on Conanicut Island, with the 60-day cycles and a curriculum written by men in an office on Broadway. Go looking for who paid for that, and the Army's own pamphlet goes quiet on you. It runs to hundreds of pages on how these men were fed and housed and worked and paid. It mentions the re-education program twice, and then points you at a different manuscript that is not in your hands. What there was an argument. The ticket money coming in from the film showings, and what the newspaper earned, helped bolster the claim that the re-education program was paying for itself. Whoever was making that claim, look at what is underneath it. The money in it came out of a German prisoner's pocket. So the accounts will not tell us the whole cost, but what the Army built will tell us what it was for. It was building a staff. By the end, the program was running 4 schools, and they were not 4 versions of the same school. Fort Kearney in Narragansett came first. About 85 prisoners, hand-picked and carefully vetted, ardent anti-Nazis, professors, writers, and artists. They called it the factory. They wrote the newspaper. In the Army's description of that work, selected German prisoners worked as translators, editors, and counselors. They reviewed films for whether they were suitable to show, and gave the commentary when they were shown. They translated pamphlets for the other prisoners, and they went through the camp newspapers looking for detrimental material. Fort Getty, on Conanicut Island, was the administrative school. 60-day cycles, a few hundred men at a time, on a curriculum built for men who might be running a German town within the year. Its language department was the biggest department in the school, and that is where Captain Moulton worked. Fort Wetherill, a few miles down the road, was a training center to prepare prisoners for police duty. And then there was Fort Eustis in Virginia, which was something else entirely. Eustis was the mass version. The administration course compressed into 6 intense days, run for groups of 2,000 men at a time who were already on their way home. The prisoners had a name for it: the 6-day bicycle race. More than 23,000 of them went through it. Put those numbers beside each other because the shape of them is the whole argument. Nearly 18,000 prisoners looked at as candidates. Fewer than 4,000 chosen. 816 picked out for Fort Getty, and a few hundred at a time coming out of the far end, over 5 cycles, through the summer and into the autumn of 1945. That is not a mass conversion campaign. That is a hiring process. The United States was auditioning the men it had captured for jobs in the country it was about to occupy. And it worked, in the narrow sense that the school existed, and the men graduated, and the ships went back across the Atlantic. What nobody in that division could tell you, in 1945, was whether the thing they had built survived contact with Germany. They would not find out for 2 years, and before we get there, something went through those camps that no curriculum could have produced, and no lesson plan could have survived. In the spring of 1945, the camp started showing films. Not lectures, not the newspaper. Film. The Allied armies were walking into the concentration camps, and the Signal Corps was walking in behind them with cameras. What they shot was cut into a documentary called Nazi Concentration Camps, directed by George Stevens and produced by John Ford, and it was carried into the courtroom at Nuremberg and played as evidence. A second film, Death Mills, was made for German audiences, with Billy Wilder supervising the edit. That is what the world was about to see. What the camps inside the United States put in front of their German prisoners. The record describes more plainly than that. Documentaries of the horrors of the Nazi death camps at Dachau and Auschwitz, and German soldiers were made to sit and watch. I want to be exact about the word made. The record says attendance at some of these showings was mandatory, not all of them, some. And the article the program had been named after is an article about diversions that prisoners organize for themselves. The prisoners had a name for these films too, bone films. Gerhard Hennes sat in one of those audiences, and this is how he described the men around him. They stared in silence, struggling but unable to believe what we Germans had done to Jews, gypsies, prisoners of war, and many others deemed inferior or expendable. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, 1,000 prisoners burned their German uniforms. Nobody ordered that. They did it themselves, out of shame. At Eglin Field in Florida, prisoners took up a collection among themselves and contributed $2,371 to American war charities. At Camp Blandings, an entire company put statements on the record. And if the story stopped there, it would be a very good story, and a false one, because a great many of them did not believe it. A former prisoner named Heinrich Imhorst remembered men shouting at the American officers that the film was not true, and producing 3 men from their own camp who had worked at concentration camps to say that these had been work camps and nothing more. Another prisoner, Reinhold Pabel, wrote down what he heard around him afterwards, and it is a sentence you can still hear in the world today. Why the hell did they show that to us? We did not do it. And then there is the number. Later on, a survey went out to 20,000 prisoners who were about to be sent home. Nearly 2/3 of them still refused to believe that Germany had committed the atrocities they had been shown. 2/3. After the films, after the newspaper and the classrooms and the lectures, after a year of a persuasion campaign designed by professionals, run on a captive audience with unlimited time and total control of the environment. That is the honest measurement, and it did not come from a critic of the program. It came from asking the men themselves on their way out the door. So what became of the ones it did reach? Here is the name everybody reaches for. Walter Hallstein was a German law professor. He was captured in France in June of 1944 and held in a prisoner of war camp in the United States, where he organized what the prisoners called a camp university. He attended the administrative school at Fort Getty. By February of 1946, he was teaching at the University of Frankfurt, and that April, he was elected its rector. 12 years after that, in January of 1958, Walter Hallstein became the first president of the Commission of the European Economic Community, the institution that grew into the European Union. That is the story as it usually gets told, and I could stop right there, and you would come away believing an American school in Rhode Island helped build modern Europe. I am not going to do that, because Hallstein did not say it. He wrote to a researcher in 1975, and he was warm about the place. The atmosphere in the stalag between the inmates, the teachers, and the staff was terrific. And in that same material, he says the Getty schooling did not help him much. The best advertisement the program ever had declined to advertise it. Down at the other end, the men who did not become anything are more revealing. In June of 1946, a graduate named Konrad Sperber, 39 years old, told an American reporter something that should have set off every alarm in Washington. It is sad but true that some of us do not feel safe to go around flashing the diploma we received from the course in democracy at Fort Getty. Sit with that. The United States had certified these men, and for some of them, in the Germany they went home to, the certificate was a liability. It marked you as somebody's collaborator. And in Washington, almost nobody was checking. The program had graduated its classes and put them on ships, and as one frustrated man involved in it noted, there was little follow-up by the U.S. Army in terms of job placement in Germany. Which brings us back to Captain Moulton. In April of 1947, the War Department gave Captain William Moulton a temporary assignment. The wording of it is dry. He was going to Germany for the purpose of assisting the Office of Military Government in the field of education and information, and more specifically, to study the present activities of German nationals who had been trained in the program. Look past the language at what is actually being done. The war has been over for 2 years. The Special Projects Division is finished. The offices at 50 Broadway are closed. There is no political advantage to anybody in the answer. And the United States Army takes one of the men who taught in the school and sends him back across the ocean to go and find his students. Nobody I can find made them do this. I went looking for the congressional inquiry, the scandal, the reporter chasing the story. I did not find one. He went to Berlin. He went to Munich and Hamburg and Stuttgart and Frankfurt. He came back with about 500 names and addresses of men who had been through the special projects schools. And out of that 500, the number he had managed to sit down with in person was 100 and some. Some of those conversations ran 15 minutes. Some ran several hours. Hold those two numbers next to each other, because the distance between them is the finding. 500 names, 100 conversations. I am doing that arithmetic myself, by the way. The report does not do it for you. I do not know what stopped him at 100, and the record does not say. In Germany in 1947, I can think of a dozen things it might have been. What I can tell you is that this is not a failure of effort. It is what the aftermath of a war does to a list of addresses. And what he found in those 100 conversations was not a triumph, and it was not a disaster. Plenty of the Fort Getty graduates had found work with the American occupation authorities or with the new German civilian administration, which is exactly what the school had been built to produce. Others were stopped cold by red tape and gave up in frustration. The record does not tell me what the red tape was. It tells me they gave up. The following January, a separate American opinion survey put the question to 78 Getty graduates and asked them how it was going. Most of them complained about the same thing. Nazi and militarist elements, they said, are met everywhere. There is one more line, down in the footnotes of all this, and it is a small one, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it. 12 former prisoners from one particular camp had been located, and Moulton never made contact with them. I am not suggesting anything by that. He had 5 cities and 500 names, and one man's working hours. 12 men fell off the bottom of a list. He wrote it up when he got home. The report is called Former Prisoners of War. It is dated the 26th of June, 1947. 2 copies of it have been traced. One sits in a German federal archive inside the papers of an American official. The other was in Moulton's own personal files. And out of that trip came the hardest sentence I found anywhere in this story. It did not come from a critic of the United States. It came from one of the teachers. The whole picture is the peculiar one of a democracy running a dictatorship to teach people about democracy. That is an American officer writing about an American program after the Army sent him to go and look at it. He wrote it down in frustration in 1947, and it survived, which is the only reason you and I get to hear it now. I have thought about which part of this is really the story. The classroom is remarkable. 85 men writing a newspaper behind wire is remarkable. Prisoners paying for their own education out of the profit on their own cigarettes is a detail I would not have believed if it were not sitting in the Army's own history, on page 160, where anybody can go and check it. But none of that is the rare part. Governments start programs constantly. Programs are easy. Believing in one is easy. The school is not the remarkable part. The audit is. 2 years after it was over, with nothing I can find forcing it, the United States Army sent a man back across the Atlantic to count what was left of it. Let him find out that the answer was somewhere between disappointing and mixed, and let him write it down without softening it. The men on those benches in 1945 could not know whether any of it took. Neither could the sergeant at the blackboard. The only difference between that program and almost every other program is that somebody went back and looked. Now, I want something from you, and this time it is not a name. Somewhere in your family there is a piece of paper saying a man completed a course. A certificate, a training card, a diploma from a school the service put him through, sometimes for something he never used again. Go and find it. Tell me what it says, and then tell me the part the paper does not say. Whether it ever counted for anything once he got home. Because that is the question the Army asked in 1947, and it is the one almost nobody asks. Put it in the comments. Somebody should go back and check.